Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Calumet College. I'm David Leyton Brown, the Master of Calumet. Some of you were here a year ago when our speaker today spoke on a very different topic. But before I get to topic, I want to say a little bit about our speaker today. One of the principles by which we've tried to organize the intellectual life of Calumet College is the nepotism principle. And as I've said before, there's nothing wrong with nepotism as long as you keep it in the family.
Very smart.
My father, Howard Leyton Brown, spoke a year ago about his life in music, imaginative title, Music as a Way of Life. And in that context, those of you who were here heard about his solo performance career, his symphony career, his university career, his teaching career, which has not ended yet. But there was mention of the fact that during the Second World War, his musical life was interrupted by his military service. This year, and especially at this time of year, close to Remembrance Day, he will be talking about those interrupting years and a little bit of how he kept music alive during that period. But really this is about his experience in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. And before I say anything more about what he is going to say, I will let him say it for himself. Howard Leyton.
Hi. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Some of you know I'll have to repeat some of the introduction, but you'll excuse me if I do because I prepared it that way and I don't want him stealing my thunder. Some of you may remember that when I spoke here a year ago on the subject Music as a Way of Life, I mentioned that my career in music had been interrupted by 6 years' service in the Royal Air Force during World War II. It is that period about which I'm going to speak today. To begin with, I need to tell you something of the political climate prevailing in England in the years leading up to the outbreak of war. The gradual return of Germany to a position of power and influence had not gone unnoticed, and Hitler's efforts were admired by many, including the Duke of Windsor, or King Edward VIII, as it was. Even Neville Chamberlain was deceived by Hitler's apparently innocent intentions. Gradually, however, the ruthless character of the Nazi system became a matter of public knowledge, and the eventual safety of England herself a cause for concern. It was in that atmosphere that war was declared on September 3rd, 1939. I was still an Australian citizen and immediately decided to enlist in the Australian forces, so went the next day, September 4th, to Australia House in London to offer my services. I was told that I would have to return to Australia at my own expense to do so. This dampened my enthusiasm, and I decided to wait to see what happened. Well, as you may know, what happened was the so-called phony war, during which Hitler achieved success after success, but left England relatively unscathed. Then came the Battle of Britain, which was announced as the precursor to the invasion of England. It was then that I decided to wait no longer, but to enlist in the British forces. My choice of the RAF was influenced by my career as a violinist, even though I had until then never even been in an airplane. I could not see myself with a violin in the muddy trenches of France, typical of World War I, and I did not know if I would be permitted on board a warship carrying a violin, but in the Air Force I would at least be within reach of my home in London, wherever I was stationed. There was also the romanticism attaching to the fighter pilots known as the cream of Britain's manhood. I thought that would suit me. In any event, I enlisted by coincidence on the anniversary of the start of the war, September 3rd, 1940. As an Australian, I was not subject to conscription, but with the aid of influential friends, my enlistment into the RAF was expedited, and I was sent to Uxbridge for an interview by a selection board. Incidentally, when I told my violin teacher, Max Rothschild, of my decision, he was very upset and said that he felt like an architect who had built a magnificent mansion and only had to put on the roof. At Uxbridge, I was interrogated by a panel of senior officers who seemed antagonistic, perhaps because I had listed my 3 choices for service as number 1, pilot, number 2, pilot, number 3, pilot, but who probably adopted a confrontational attitude to test the characteristics of the recruits. I later found that they had approved my request for pilot training and had given me a strong recommendation for a commission. While at Uxbridge, I was issued with a uniform and battle dress, etc., but had my first experience with opposition to my intention to continue my career as a musician. To keep us busy, we were given meaningless duties to perform, including moving stores from one place to another and back again. I would finish as quickly as possible and then return to the barracks room to practice. The NCO, that's non-commissioned officer, in charge, a flight sergeant, would catch me there and give me another job. After several such episodes, he yelled that if I didn't stop, he would put his foot through my fiddle. I yelled back, which is a real breach of discipline, and this is what I said: "If you do, rubber guts, I'll put my foot through you." Now, I have subsequently thought I wished I had reworded that. It would sound much better if I said, if he didn't stop, I would put my foot through his middle, rhyming with fiddle. Wouldn't that have been better? However, I have to tell the truth. So I just said, if you do, rubber guts, I'll put my foot through you. Nothing more was said. It was from Uxbridge that I saw the fires burning in London when the docks along the Thames were bombed for the first time. Then it was off to Torquay for initial training. This included such courses as signals, Morse code, etc., navigation, aircraft recognition, armaments. I learned to dismantle a Browning machine gun blindfolded in 22 seconds. I wouldn't know which end was which now, but I learned that at the time. Drill and physical training. We also received a number of inoculations. It was here that my violin playing was appreciated for the first time. The commanding officer, Air Commodore, Air Commodore Critchley, a well-known cricketer with high social connections, quickly found a use for me as entertainment at his dinner parties and social fundraising activities. To make this possible, he issued me a pass that excused me from duty, curfew, etc., whenever I needed to practice. I didn't abuse this privilege, but I did make use of it. On one occasion, we were visited by Air Marshal Sir Guy Garrard, head of Training Command, and Critchley asked me to play at a dinner in his honor. Our course commander, a wing commander, was designated to drive me to and from the function, but was not a guest. The lowest rank, apart from me, a lowly AC2, that's aircraftsman second class, the lowest possible rank. Apart from that, the lowest rank was group captain. After I had played, Sir Guy told me that he too was a violinist, and we soon had our arms round each other, singing the theme from the Brahms Clarinet Quintet, with which we were both familiar. He then told me that if I failed my course as a pilot, I should contact him, and he would put me in charge of classical music for the RAF. Who knows what would have happened if I had followed that path, but the offer only served to motivate me to succeed at all costs. After initial training, now an LAC, that's leading aircraftman, the second rank, I was sent to Prestwick, Scotland, number 15 war course, to learn to fly Tiger Moths. Among my instructors was a young operational pilot who had been demoted for rolling a Wellington bomber. David asked me what I meant by rolling a Wellington bomber. He thought in a ditch or something. No, he did the aerobatics doing a roll in midair with a Wellington. So he was demoted to elementary instructor. He also nearly scared me to death by performing a loop at low level, finishing a few feet from the ground under a line of telegraph wires. Since there was still a real threat of invasion, our instructor included the dropping of handheld 5-pound bombs. Can you imagine in a Tiger Moth with a handheld bomb dropping it over the side, 5-pound bomb on the invading Nazis? I finished first in my class, and certainly didn't fail, as Sir Garrett had suggested, and I was posted to number 11 SFTS, that's Service Flying Training School, at Shawbury, Shropshire, for training on twin-engined Oxfords. Not fighters, as I had hoped. This may have been because I was not particularly adept at aerobatics, possibly because of the influence of my daredevil instructor. More probably it was due to a need for bomber crews for the retaliatory raids, which were then intensified. At Shawbury, I began to adjust fully to life as a pilot, and I found opportunities to fly in Oxfords, a Beaufighter, Whitley, Blenheim, Battle, Manchester, and Anston. I completed all the necessary classwork and again came first in my course. My first knowledge of this successful outcome was given me by the local tailor from Shrewsbury, who offered to make my uniforms as a pilot officer in anticipation of my success. I agreed and was delighted to receive this promotion. On leave before my first posting, I was proudly wearing my new uniform, walking along Knightsbridge with my mother when I was passed by a troop of soldiers marching in the opposite direction. The order, eyes left, was given, and I promptly returned the salute, but with the awful feeling that the salute might not have been for me, but for a much senior officer walking behind me. Such was not the case, however. And now, until now, all instructors had finished tours of operational flying, but because of shortages, it had been decided to train some recent graduates to fulfill these duties. Our course had been chosen to supply the first two, and I therefore found myself on the way to Cranwell, number 2 CIS, which is a Central Instructor School, for training as an instructor. Cranwell was a pre-war establishment, luxurious by comparison with any other station that I had seen so far. The mess was like a country mansion with a huge dining hall, white tablecloths, silver cutlery, white-coated servants, etc. However, I had evidence of the dangers of life on active service one day when leaving the dining hall. One of the waiters was entering as I was leaving, and we both stopped abruptly to avoid a collision. Unfortunately, he was carrying a big dish of rice pudding, and while he stopped, the rice pudding did not, but hit me full in the chest in my nice new uniform. We trained here on the Avro Tutor and the Oxford, and were paired with other students with whom we honed our skills. After Cranwell, I returned to Shawbury and began my new career as an instructor. Life as an officer with my own room and a personal batman was a great improvement, and I even found opportunities to continue with my music. There was a station concert party, which entertained frequently in the community, but more importantly, the adjutant was a competent pianist. There were negative experiences too, of course. One when my former instructor, squadron leader Spear, was killed walking into a spinning air screw at night. And another when a German Junkers 88 landed on the field one night, taxied round, took off and shot at many of the buildings. Strange. An interesting highlight of this period was a posting to number 1 BAS, that's Blind Approach School, Watchfield, where I was trained in the use of the Lorentz beam for blind landings. If any of you want to ask about these technical activities, please do so later on. On return, I was promoted to flying officer, but learned that I was on the list for overseas posting for the BCATP, which is British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Fortunately, my friendly pianist, the adjutant, was able to cancel several of those postings to Canada or Rhodesia until he went on leave and the inevitable happened. So we were not told our destination, but embarked on an American troop ship, the George Eliot, at Liverpool, and set sail in a convoy which headed for New York. The onboard accommodation was atrocious. 150 officers crowded into a forehold in the prow of the ship, where most were seasick throughout the voyage. Not I am happy to say. Meals were barely adequate because it had been intended to return to New York empty, and food supplies were severely limited in wartime England. The voyage was relatively uneventful as far as enemy action was concerned, though we were informed that a torpedo had missed our ship by 50 feet, and that a submarine had been sunk by one of our accompanying naval vessels. We also learned that a previous group of instructors destined for Estevan had been lost in the sinking of the Louis Pasteur on a different convoy. Upon arriving in New York, we were immediately put into trains and headed for Moncton, where we were finally sorted into groups and found out where we were to be stationed. This took a couple of weeks, and during that time I again found opportunities to play the violin. Unfortunately, the only available pianist was incompetent, and on one occasion, in exasperation, I said that I would play a piece by Bach that had no accompaniment, upon which he said, "Never mind, I'll just put in a chord now and then." The trip to Estevan was memorable. Comfortable sleeping cars, beautiful scenery, incredible meals, etc., and an amazing reception when we arrived at our destination. The whole town had turned out to meet the train and transport us to the airport, which was about 3.5 miles south of town. Then began a period of settling in. I was immediately promoted to flight lieutenant and put in command of one of the 4 flights. We were to use twin-engined ensigns, but initially had only a few battle-scarred planes available, some still with bullet holes. Eventually, new planes arrived, along with our first course of students. We were to teach mainly students from England, but during my 2 years in Estevan, there were a few from Australia and New Zealand, and quite a few Canadians. I was quickly appointed entertainment officer because of my music, and sports officer, I guess because I was an Australian. I couldn't think of any other reason. In any event, I found in our group an airman with a musical background, Richard Valery, who had been Gracie Field's accompanist in England. Gracie Fields was the most popular singer during the war in England, a tremendous reputation. So it was quite something to be her accompanist. And he undertook to organize a dance band and our annual variety shows called Go for Pie. I also found a former professional soccer player who organized a football team with which we won the Saskatchewan Championship. I was the goalkeeper. So when I say goalkeeper, you know what kind of football this was. Soccer, not Canadian Championships, which Saskatchewan is going to win again, by the way. As you can see, life in general was pretty normal, and the next 2 years were amongst the happiest that I ever experienced. We arrived on a Tuesday, and I met my eventual wife, Merle, at church on the Sunday, but that is another story. There are many other events during this period that I could chronicle, but I will only tell you of a couple. One was of a plane landing and overshooting the runway in a cloud of dust. Since the plane was from my flight, I hopped in the truck and went out to see what had happened. The instructor had apparently dozed off, leaving the student to complete the landing. On the approach, they hit a prairie chicken, which had penetrated the windshield and struck the instructor on the head, a blow from which he was slowly recovering. I picked up the chicken and later took it into town, where Merle's mother cooked it for supper. On another occasion, one of the ground crew came into my office carrying a small branch covered in leaves, which he had found embedded in the leading edge of the wing of one of our planes. This was obviously the result of illegal low flying, and since it was only a few days after an accident in which the pilot and his 4 passengers had been killed, I decided to take action to prevent a recurrence. I called all the instructors into my office and told them that no one, including myself, was to do low-flying exercises in the future, with the exception of one, whom I knew would obey orders, and another who was too cautious, I nearly used the word scared, to fly below the legal limit of 200 feet. I had recently been appointed examining officer in addition to my other duties, and my category as instructor had been upgraded to A2. I could also add the Harvard, Crane, and Bolingbroke to my list of planes with which I was familiar. I had also by now given numerous public performances in Estevan and Regina, and had been called the Viking of the Skies by the music critic of Regina's Leader Post. By way of contrast, I was also known as Killer Brown because of my prowess at soccer. Merle and I had become engaged at Christmas 1943 and planned a June wedding. However, we suddenly discovered that the station was to close early in the new year and that I was due to return to England in February. Accordingly, we were married on February the 9th, and I was given 2 weeks' leave for a honeymoon, which I was to spend en route to Halifax for embarkation. This 2-week period expanded into 6 because of shipping problems, but Merle and I spent the time happily in Montreal, skiing in the Laurentians or visiting Niagara Falls. Eventually, however, I found myself on the New Amsterdam, which set sail for England unescorted. Before leaving Estevan, I had been given the usual 3 choices for future postings, and I had selected Coastal Command, Transport Command, and Night Fighters. The first 2 because of the possibility of returning to Canada, where, of course, Merle was remaining for the foreseeable future, and the 3rd because of my fondness for the Beaufighter. As you will see, I did not succeed as well as I had when I had selected pilot, pilot, pilot when enlisting. Since we were sailing at 33 knots, our trip was uneventful and we arrived safely at Liverpool. I immediately phoned my mother in London to tell her that I was back. And it was then that the war became more personal for me because her first words to me were, "Valerie's lost," Valerie being my sister. She was a trained nurse and had enlisted in the army. She had been serving on a hospital ship in the Indian Ocean when they were sunk by a Japanese submarine. I was disappointed to find that I was posted to Bomber Command, but understood the need for bomber crews because of the increasing losses being experienced. In any event, off I went to number 18 OTU, Operational Training Unit, at Finningley. Here I flew Wellingtons and learned many of the procedures associated with operational flying. Such things as the corkscrew defense against enemy fighters or the evasive maneuver when subjected to radar-directed flak. We also received instructions for parachuting and ditching at sea. We were also given the opportunity to select the other members who were to make up our crews. In my case, I was fortunate in being approached by a navigator, Sergeant Williams, and a wireless operator, Flight Sergeant Johnson, who asked if they could join my crew. I found that they had both come top in their courses, so I readily agreed and asked them to find the 2 gunners that were needed. They soon returned with Sergeant Lester, rear gunner, and Sergeant McMullen, mid-upper gunner. We trained together as a crew, completing 76.5 hours in the Wellington before leaving for Lindholm, number 1656 HCU, which is Heavy Conversion Unit. Here we completed our crew with the addition of Sergeant Hawkins, flight engineer, and Flight Sergeant Patterson, bomb aimer. We were now given training on such things as fighter affiliation, bombing, modern techniques of navigation, evasion if brought down in enemy territory, etc. All this, of course, on the 4-engined Halifax, in which we flew a total of 46 hours. One day, however, a Lancaster landed on a diversion because of bad weather, and I knew at once that that was the plane I wanted to fly. The pilot had been a pupil at Estevan and had just completed his tour of operations. He had been lucky enough to have done all his trips on targets on the French coast and had actually flown over enemy territory for only 26 hours. This compares with the 130 and a quarter hours for my tour. From Lindholm, we were sent to Hemswell, number 1 LFS, which is Lancaster Flying School, where we completed our training on Lancasters, to my delight. And then at last to Elsham Wolds in Yorkshire, number 576 Squadron. And this is the 576 Squadron crest, which I wear proudly. It was customary for the pilot to fly as second pilot for a familiarization flight with an experienced crew, increasing his tour to 31 rather than 30. And in my case, it was arranged for me to fly with a pilot who was on his third tour, a squadron leader, Stacy. The target was Frankfurt, and my flak-happy mentor instructed the navigator to get us to our destination 15 minutes early so that we could have a good look around. Of course, this meant that the defences had a good look at us too, and we circled Frankfurt, coned by searchlights and with shells bursting round for what seemed forever. I had been sent into the bomb aimer's compartment for a better view of the target, and while there was hit in the stomach by a piece of shrapnel from a nearby exploding shell. Fortunately, it hit squarely on the parachute harness release box, so that I was unharmed. If it had not, it would have gone right through. On our return, I told my crew that I had been saved by a lucky gremlin. You may not know that we had in the Air Force good and bad gremlins, and this was a good one. And in fact, I will tell you about this. At this point, I have to tell you that on our honeymoon, Merle had given me a stuffed doll bearing a nameplate, "I'm Bertie the Gremlin." And here he is. This is Bertie the Gremlin. His nameplate has long since disappeared. Now, I told my crew about this. I showed Bertie to the crew, who demanded that he should fly with us from then on. And this he did in a little bag around my neck. All my trips had Bertie along as a passenger. Another superstition developed later during a daylight trip. In the half hour before takeoff, we were relaxing on the grass around the plane when I found a 4-leaf clover. It was then determined to do so for each of our succeeding trips, and this we managed to do, even though it meant on one occasion all 7 of us crawling all over the lawn in front of the commanding officer's office. He must have thought we were mad. Possibly there was some luck involved in our survival, but skill and good teamwork were needed too. On our station, there were 2 squadrons, number 576 and number 29, each with 21 crews. And during my time there, we were only the second crew to finish a tour. The losses became so severe that when I had completed 27 trips, I was suddenly informed that instead of 31, I was to do 37. I can give you an example of the severity of the losses that we were incurring. It was decided to try to sink the battleship Tirpitz, which was sheltering in the Heligoland Bight. 10 planes equipped with H-2S radar were sent to lay mines in the Tirpitz's path, and of the 10, only 4 returned. We were flying above the clouds in bright moonlight and were easy targets for the enemy fighters. In all my trips, we were attacked by fighters 5 times, hit by flak 4 times, had an engine catch fire on takeoff, had at least one near collision, were nearly hit by bombs dropped by a plane flying above, etc., etc. Our only loss was our rear gunner, Sergeant Lester, who missed a trip with us because of illness and who was required to do a catch-up trip with another crew. This crew was lost, and Warrant Officer Hiscox became our new rear gunner. He was formerly the gunnery instructor on the squadron, but one of his pupils had fired a gun in the lecture theatre and had wounded another student. But this was by accident, but Hiscox was considered to be responsible, so he was punished by being put on active service again. He was a wonderful man. I did see several fatal episodes. One, a collision between a Halifax and Lancaster over Lincoln, with nothing left but a big ball of fire and smoke. And 2, on an early raid on Duisburg, a Halifax flying about 100 yards ahead of us and about 100 yards above, opened its bomb doors and exploded, leaving us to fly through the debris. On another occasion, on a raid on Pforzheim, having been warned of a new offensive weapon being used by German fighters, a dorsal cannon, meaning one firing vertically, I was looking back after leaving the target when I saw a blazing Lancaster diving toward the ground half a mile behind. I warned the crew and then saw another Lancaster on fire only a quarter of a mile back, from which I knew that there was a fighter in the stream gradually catching up with us. Knowing that this new German technique involves an attack from below, I again warned the crew to be on the lookout. Shortly thereafter, our new rear gunner yelled "corkscrew port," and we literally dropped in front of a Junkers 88, giving Hiscox a clear shot. We later claimed a victory, but had insufficient evidence for approval. Flak damage on raids on Misburg and Merseburg resulted in returns on 3 engines, and a couple of times we had to land using FIDO, which is fog intensive dispersal of, so we knew that Bertie was earning his keep. There were many other trips that I could describe, but one in particular I cannot omit. It was our 5th trip and our first on the Ruhr. We did in total 27 of my 37 trips on the Ruhr. After climbing to the required height of 1,000 feet for testing the G-set, which was our main navigational aid, we discovered that the set was unserviceable. I radioed back to the station with this information and asked for instructions. After a few minutes, the reply came, "Carry on with exercise as planned." With reluctance, we set course for Reading, our first turning point. But in the near darkness, we soon observed that we were deviating from the direction taken by the other planes. This was obviously the result of faulty meteorological information. We could not use G for a correction, and escaped a mid-air collision over Reading by a miracle. I don't know how close the aircraft must have been when it crossed in front of us. All I know is that I could see the exhaust from the engines about literally feet in front of my plane. Anyway, we lost contact with the stream completely and went over Denmark, were attacked by a fighter. Lester, the rear gunner, yelled corkscrew port, and I put the plane into a violent turning dive to the left. This caused all the navigation equipment and any other loose objects to fly up and hit the roof. We completed the maneuver and managed to evade the fighter. When everything settled down, I heard the voice of Johnny, our wireless operator, shouting, "Skipper, Skipper, I'm hit." I immediately told Taffy, the navigator, to go and see what had happened. He found that in the initial dive, Johnny's parachute pack had flown to the roof and in falling had hit him on the head with a metal buckle. In the meantime, a flask of coffee, heavily laced with sugar for energy, which was on the seat beside him, had also hit the roof and burst, showering him with a warm, sticky liquid, which he took to be blood. After this excitement, we continued on our approximate route and arrived at what we believed to be Neuss. We could see no other planes, flak, or searchlights, but there was a big fire burning beneath the clouds. So we dropped our bombs and headed for home. It was then I decided that I had had enough and told the navigator to plot a course straight back to base instead of following the circuitous route that had been planned. We were again attacked by a fighter, which we successfully evaded, and then used our H-2S to check our position when crossing the English coast. We arrived back and landed safely nearly 2 hours before the rest of the squadron. A car was waiting as we left the plane, and I was informed that I was wanted in the control tower. When I arrived, I found myself confronted by the air officer commanding group, the station commander, and several other senior officers. I was shouted at and given a dressing down for breaking every rule in the book and causing the Home Guard to be called out all along the East Coast. I replied that with an unserviceable G-set, the whole exercise had been futile, to which the shouted response was, "What do you mean the G was US? You left your charts on the bus." When I told them that the charts that had been found after our departure were not ours, but belonged to a crew on an earlier training flight, the quiet response was, "Oh." But nothing more was said, no apology or anything. I then realized that we had been ordered to complete the mission as a punishment, an action which I think was reprehensible in the extreme. After our 16th trip, the squadron moved to Fiskardon in Lincolnshire, where I completed my tour. Since arriving at 576 Squadron, I had not had opportunity for musical performance, but continued to practice at least 1 hour a day. I had, however, if you will allow the pun, added another string to my bow. I had learned to play squash, and on one occasion played well enough to be on the Bomber Command team in an inter-service competition. Keep that in mind. When leaving Fiskardon, after having said farewell to my crew, I was posted to Wolfhouse Lodge, number 1651, HCU, Heavy Conversion Unit, and Swinderby, number 1660 HCU, again as an instructor. But with the war drawing to a close, I asked to be relieved of flying duties to prevent any further damage to my hearing that I may already have suffered. I was then appointed airmanship officer in charge of the Lancaster simulator. I was also asked to write an updated instruction manual for the Lancaster. Knowing that I would shortly be demobilized, I increased my practicing to 2 hours a day. And all went well until our new commanding officer complained that someone kept him awake all night playing the saxophone. Perhaps it was only a coincidence that my name came up for demobilization shortly thereafter. But in any event, in a final interview, he tried to persuade me to stay in the RAF, saying that if I did, I could teach people to play squash. I think that's marvelous. I replied that I had taught people to play the violin since I was 9, and I was not about to change to squash. I flew for the last time on January the 13th, 1946, and left for Uxbridge with a total of 2,093 hours and 40 minutes as a pilot, the Distinguished Flying Cross for service beyond the call of duty, and an assessment of above average at every posting. At Uxbridge, I found to my amusement that the NCO in charge was still the same flight sergeant and was still called Rubber Guts. I was issued with the customary suit and sundries, and in that way my service in the RAF was concluded. End of story. There you are.
We have some time for questions, and I'll let you field them yourself. But just to break the ice, yesterday evening you were telling me about evading fighters.
Yes.
Which maybe from watching too many movies, I thought was a trickier thing than you actually described.
No.
Could you explain what happened?
Yes, it's a very simple thing. It was based on the principle that fighter planes had fixed guns that fired forward. So if they were to hit a plane that was flying across in front of them, they had to aim. If any of you go duck hunting, you know this. You have to shoot ahead of what you see, or else the shot will go behind them. And so a fighter attacking a bomber would come in from the side, and he would have to be ahead of it. Now, if you, what we did was to dive like this, so he had to dive to follow us. He was going faster than we were going, and so he would overshoot us and never get in position to get ahead of us. So his bullets would always miss us. We would dive and turn, and then turn again, and he would try to follow us. My gunners would hear what I was saying. I would say diving port, turning, diving starboard, climbing, turning, climbing starboard, turning, climbing port. That's the corkscrew. We'd go like that. And finish up back on our original track, by which time the fighter would know where we were. In the meantime, our gunners, hearing my instruction, would know what deviation to take to hit the fighter. And we had evidence from our tracers that we damaged fighters more often than not, and we were never hit by one. So that's what the corkscrew was. It was infallible, provided you saw the fighter before he shot you. If you didn't, you were in trouble. In those days, we wore shorts with detachable collars, and I used to take my collar off before I went and just have the the neck of the shirt. And I would be twisting my head so much. Every time I came back, I had like a rope burn around my neck from twisting and watching. I nearly always saw the fighters before the rest of the crew. That's in answer to your question.
And the dorsal gun fighters you didn't see because...
They were down below us. The new system for the German fighters with the dorsal cannon meant that they could creep underneath your plane. They were, of course, painted black, and we couldn't see them against the ground below us. We would have done if there were clouds. On that raid, I told you when we were trying to put mines down to catch the turpits, there was cloud base, a fluffy cloud. It was like the mattress on your bed. You know, if you put any object, if you put a shoe on your bed, you know how easily you could see it. A black shoe on this white surface. Well, that's what our planes looked like. The fighters had no trouble at all. But they couldn't catch us. We were attacked by fighters on that occasion. That was rather interesting too, because to lay the mines, we had to use the H2S set. I've mentioned that. That was a radar set that shot a radar beam down at the ground, and it was reflected back. And you could then plot what the ground shape was, like the rivers and so on. The unfortunate thing was, of course, if we used that, the ground forces could track us back on our radar beam. So we were not allowed to use it very frequently. And in fact, not many crews were trained on it. My crew was, and that was why we were selected for that trip. And when we took the corkscrew, we were afraid that we had gone off track. But when we came out of it, the H2S showed we were exactly on the point where we had to drop the mines. So it worked very, very well indeed. The one about the defense against the radar flak was also, I found it amusing. Of course, we were not always facing radar-directed flak. Sometimes it was just so many guns shooting up at us we wouldn't know what it was. But on one occasion, this one I'm talking about, we had been targeted on Cologne. And the master bomber called us up when we were approaching the target and said it was largely cloud-covered. And in order for us not to bomb the Cologne Cathedral, they said we were not to drop our bombs unless we could identify a target through the clouds. Well, we approached Cologne, and I looked through the clouds, and there was an opening somewhere, and I saw the, what was it called? Anyway, it was a factory involved in generation of power. I've forgotten the name of it. And a big, long building. And I said we will bomb that. So we targeted it and did drop our bombs and hit it squarely. And then the navigator said your new track is such and such, which involves a turn to the left to port. And then after a little while, a further turn to port. We took this further turn all above clouds, and suddenly there was a burst of flak all around us. And we were all by ourselves. I didn't know what had happened to the rest of them. And then I realized that in finding the target that I had found, I had gone to the port side, the left side of Cologne. And I was about 20 miles from the center of Cologne. So that meant I was now 20 miles to the starboard of the track we should be taking. And through a break in the clouds, I said, what is that built-up area below us? we shouldn't be flying over anything like that. And the navigator said, that's Bonn. And I said, what the deuce are we doing over Bonn? We shouldn't be anywhere near this. But that was where the radar flak was coming from. And we were the only plane just there. So I said, we've been targeted by radar flak, so I'll tell you how we escaped from this. And I said, we now turn starboard 30 degrees, and we fly for 10 seconds. And then I want you to look to port, and in another 7 seconds, you will see the flak burst there. And what happens was that at our height, it took them 17 seconds for the shells to be targeted at our height and for them to reach our height and explode. So we flew for 10 seconds, then turned and flew for 10 seconds, and the flare came up over here. And so we looked and laughed at this, and then I said, now we turn back again, look over to starboard, bang, bang, bang over here. And then we dodged all the way and never got hit by anything. Actually, the first burst, we did get hit, but only by a small piece of shrapnel which flew through the tail right beneath the seat of the rear gunner. Went through the whole plane, just bored a hole in it, didn't do any damage. Another 18 inches higher and it would have done some unmentionable damage to our rear gunner. Yes?
What percentage of your raids were daylight versus night?
I did, no, I had the information here. I think I...
And were the German night fighters working at your time?
Oh, yes, indeed they were. In fact, I think we did, I think it was something like 33 of my raids were nighttime, maybe more.
Well, the Americans wanted to do daylight.
Oh, yes, that's another story. I'm glad you asked that, because the Americans preferred the daylight raids, but then they were flying fortresses, which had, and others, Mitchells and so on, and they had something like 7 gunners on each plane. They had wing gunners and the dorsal gunners, turret, ball turret gunners, and they had 50 caliber cannons, whereas we only had the 303 Brownings. So that's why they're called fortresses, because they were like that. But also, something strange happened. They believed in this business of daylight raids, so they tried to persuade the RAF to do the same. And one of the things that they advocated was that in doing daylight raids, they could fly in formation. So their squadrons flew packed together so that the firepower that they had was enormous. So they said we should fly in formation. Well, none of our crews had been trained to do this, but they thought, well, you could certainly do it, which was true. But in order to make it effective, they had to designate certain people to be the leaders of the formation. So how did they do it? They decided to paint white stripes on the tails of all the lead pilots. And I happened to be one of the lead pilots, so my plane was painted with white stripes. So who did the fighters want to shoot down? All the people with white tails. So we weren't very happy about that. And that brings me to another. Some clown also thought this would be a useful thing. The pilot was the captain. So let's see what we look like as a captain. Here we are. I'll do this. So they gave us this to wear. So if we were shot down, who do you think they got after first? The captain. He was the one who was responsible. So These were things we didn't really enjoy. So I think we did, if I remember correctly, about 33 of my 37 were night trips. And at the end, they took all the senior instructors in the German Air Force who were flying, training people for night fighters. They put them all into active service. So we had a tremendous lot of losses from German fighters. It was a terrible thing. I mentioned the one at Pforzheim, to look back and see a Lancaster in silhouette with flames all over, turning over and diving out of the stream. Terrible to see and know what was going on, and then to realize that this fighter was catching up with our plane. What we did on that trip, pardon me, was to go in and bomb this small town. It's called Pforzheim, and it was in southern Germany, and in peacetime had been a sort of home industry center where they made clocks and other spring-activated toys and various things like that. And they turned them all into individual production system for making bomb fuses and all sorts of things. So while it was just a blanket bombing of the whole town, it was a legitimate target from the point of view of war production. And they decided that we should go in low, and we bombed at 2,000 feet. And the reason for that was that the German fighters had been decoyed into thinking we were going to Stuttgart, which was some 100 miles or so to the north. And the fighters, we could see the contrails. They were circling at about 30,000 feet over Stuttgart, hoping to catch us there. And so by the time they realized that we were down at Pforzheim, it was difficult for them to get there and find us. But this one fighter, and maybe others, had succeeded, and it was quite a business.
How good was the intelligence when you were going on these bombing runs?
I think very good.
Was it?
Yes. We were doing raids in helping the invasion of Normandy. We did some along the coast. That was what that other fellow did. But also on one or two raids, we were trying to help the advance toward the Rhine. And, you know, the dam busters and all that sort of thing. And those were good. We had good intelligence. On one occasion, we were called back because the forces had already reached the target that we were going to bomb. And so that was in midstream. We were told to abort and go back. But on one occasion, we had reports that a small town on the way to the Ruhr named Düren was full of reinforcements for the front. And we were told to bomb this town in daylight. And as by now I was one of the senior crews, and we were given special privileges of being in the early part of the raid, because we would be presumably more accurate and so on. So I was actually the second plane to bomb this town. And the first plane to bomb it was the master bomber. And it was his job to guarantee that he led us into the target accurately and gave us instructions like on Cologne. You know, if it was cloud covered, he told us what to do. And on this occasion, I saw him drop his bombs, And if there was a crossroad in the middle of Durham with a policeman standing at the crossroads, he would have hit him on the head with his cookie. It was perfect bombing. The whole town just rose up in the air like that. The explosion from this one set of bombs from the master bomber, I think, destroyed the town. And there were 800 of us. And my bombs went second. Well, years later, my family and I were touring in Germany by car. And we visited Durham. You were with us, weren't you? I thought I'd show them this. And so we came to Durham, and all that was standing was one building. And it was full of bomb, marks, damaged holes in the wall and so on, broken windows. It was not used anymore. And they had rebuilt the city some 10 miles away, a new city, completely. There was just nothing left at all of that whole town.
What did they figure the target was?
The whole town.
Well, what were they doing in the town?
Well, that was their collection area for all these reinforcements, trucks and soldiers and all the equipment, or a complete division, I suppose. So we must have killed many civilians, of course, but you can't be choosy about that. If they've got, like in Pforzheim, if every house is a miniature factory, then you've got to do something about putting them out of action. Anyway, I think that's about all the detail I need to give you about the G set. I could tell you, if you don't know what a G set is, there were stations all over England and, of course, eventually in France when we got the invasion underway. And these stations would send out beams, directional beams, which could be plotted on a cathode ray tube and joined together so that you could position yourself within feet. You get two separate beams, and where they cross, you could plot it and know exactly where you were. They had another one called oboe, which was a single beam which pointed at the target, and particularly the mosquito bombers used oboe quite often for directing them to individual targets. The H2S, I've told you, was one that plotted the ground below us. We had other things too, IFF, which is identification, friend or foe, and that was a little signal that we sent out that was coded. So, in effect, they should have known that I was not a German when I came in over the East Coast, because I used my IFF. Anyway, I don't care tuppence if the home guy got out of bed. I was anxious to be home myself. Another thing that we had that I didn't think to mention was that, I've forgotten where we got these, but it must have been at our last posting when we went on Lancasters. All the crew was equipped with pistols, revolvers. They were Smith & Wesson 45s. And each of us was to carry this thing with us on every raid. I don't know if you've ever handled a Smith & Wesson 45, but it's a big blunderbuss of a thing. And a 6-shot revolver. And so one day, I thought my crew and I had better go out and do a bit of target practice. So off we went, walking out in the woods near Elsham Walls, and we came to a back road somewhere with a traffic sign, you know, like this. And I thought that would make a good target. It had a couple of bullet holes in it from somebody else. So all 7 of us lined up about 50 feet from this target, and we each fired 6 shots and didn't hit the target with a single one. 42 shots missed completely at about 50 feet. You know, you go and see this on the screen, you know, atomic bang, and somebody on a mountaintop, you know, 500 yards away, tumbles down dead. Well, let me tell you, it's not all that easy. So that was that. That was to be used in case we were, you know, if we parachuted down and we were being attacked by an irate farmer with a pitchfork, we could defend ourselves. But I thought you'd have to put the thing right up at his nose to do any good.
How much parachute practice did you have?
Oh, we never jumped. We just were told.
You practiced it?
No. Oh, of course not. Well, no. You might. There were accidents using parachutes, you know. It was dangerous. No, we were just told. See, the pilot wore what is called a seat-type parachute. It was attached to him with his harness, and he had to walk, you know, very awkwardly, carrying this thing bouncing on his rear end. But the others had a chest pack, a harness with 2 little metal buckles on, and their parachute pack was kept in a little compartment beside their position in the plane. And if they needed it, they undid the straps, put this on, buckled it on, and jumped. There are 2 stories that are apparently true about this. I think they're true. Not my personal experience, but on one occasion, a crew is reputed to have jumped from a Halifax, and when the Halifax exploded, and one of the crew was falling without his parachute, and he looked, and it was following him down in the air. He reached up and took it out of the air and put it on his back and was safe. The other one is not so pleasing, because this is a story, this one I guarantee was true. Somebody jumped from a plane, and his body was found on the ground later, and he was dead, of course, and they examined him and found that he had reached with his hand to pull the release, which, of course, was here over this side, and you pull with your hand like that. Well, he was left-handed, and he reached over this side with his hand, couldn't find the buckle, and started pulling and pulling, and eventually pulled so hard that he pulled right through his uniform and opened his chest wall with his fingers, pulling to get his parachute to work. So they didn't want us doing that sort of thing. They didn't actually have us do ditching at sea either, but they told us how to do it, who was responsible for this and that, and we were given opportunities. For example, the other crew would practice taking the thing out of the, hooking it on, but not jump.
What do you have on the table?
Well, lots of things. I've got, first of all, my medals, this, Bertie, my 2 logbooks with a variety of pictures. This book contains a newspaper account of every trip that I took. It announces the losses and that sort of thing. So I've got that there. I've also got some interesting things. I referred to the Phoney War. Well, during the Phoney War, what happened was that the Germans sent planes over dropping leaflets, propaganda leaflets, with quotations from Hitler's speeches and things like that.
In German?
Yes. Yes. Oh no, some of them were in English too. Well, we in turn also did some crafty things. And I have an example here which will amuse you. I hope it will amuse you. Wait until I find it now. There was, of course, a considerable shortage of food and so on in England and in Germany. So one of the things one of our clever, intelligent people dreamt up was to drop coupons in Germany for them to get extra food to try and disrupt their delivery system. So I'll find it for you and show you what they look like. I'm turning over page after page and I should have it, I don't come to it. Here we are, it's right at the end. See those pages of butter and bread coupons? And you can imagine if we dropped 1 million of these into a city where they were allowed one a month or something, and they suddenly find lying in the street here, 25 bread coupons. And if everybody suddenly flooded the stores asking for this, the whole system would break down. We dropped other things. I've heard of crews, they would drop bottles full of liquid, and as the liquid escaped, no cap on the bottle, and as the liquid escaped, it would make a blood-curdling screaming noise. So we dropped those too. And other people dropped other things, like I heard of one crew that took over a wire bed spring and dropped that out. And it made a funny whistling sound as it came down, and just drop anything that you could think of. That was the phony war.
How did you were demobilized in '46, you said?
Yeah.
And then what happened?
What happened to me?
Yeah.
I went back to study the violin on what they called a further education grant that they gave everybody on demobilization, if they wished. They didn't have to go back and study, but of course I wanted to. They also gave you a living allowance. Now it's meaningless to tell you how much it was, but I'll tell you, it was £7 a week. Well, now it costs you £7 to buy a coffee in London now, but £7 was certainly not enough to live on, and I had great difficulty.
Where was the missus in all this time?
She came over when I left Estevan. I had already paid for her to have a first-class ticket to come over as soon as she could make arrangements. And she came actually about 6 months after I returned. She was allowed to come, and it was certainly not first-class travel. It was a very poor trip. But anyway, she got there safely, and then my problem was, after the war, finding accommodation, because, of course, there was considerable damage in London and not much opportunity of finding accommodation. One place I was shown was supposed to be furnished accommodation. There was a restriction in London or in England that rental property was controlled by the government if it was empty. If you could find an empty apartment, you could get it for relatively little. If it was furnished, there was no control. Well, of course, then nobody would leave a place empty. They would fling in a few bits of broken down furniture and say it was furnished. Well, we were offered once with my £7 a week, we were offered a basement compartment of sorts. It was 2 rooms and something of a bathroom, and it had a mattress lying on the floor, no bedstead, but a mattress. It had one bare light bulb, and the rent for that was £10 a week. And I was getting £7 for everything. So it was just terrible. And it was because of that that I eventually decided to come to Canada, where things were so much better.
Sounds like first year university.
Yes, quite likely. I did make some extra money because I immediately began to recover my position as a musician. That's another story, a long story. I guess I'll just shorten it considerably. But because I had been practicing all through the war, I had not lost very much of my capacity. I had lost some, but I immediately threw myself into a very considerable effort to recover. And within a year, I entered for an international violin competition in which I came second. It was a gold medal award, Carl Sechs Gold Medal Award. The unfortunate thing was that my teacher was one of the adjudicators. And he phoned me the day after the competition, and he said, "Well, Howard, I have to tell you that you actually won the competition, but I didn't think it was good for you to win because you're still getting back, to where you should be. So you came second." I thought, boy, that's not the way you talk about nepotism and so, I would have thought he'd have lent the other direction. But anyway, I went for it a second time the year afterwards, and after that I was offered a job in the London Philharmonic Orchestra as associate concertmaster. So then I was able to live on what I was paid. But for that first year, it was awful. David was born at that time, and we had to find accommodation, for my wife and myself, and yes.
Can you tell people about what you do not have on the souvenirs?
Oh, yes. There's one thing I was bringing. I have here, for example, a piece of a shell that landed on the road outside my house, a piece of a bomb, I mean. It shows you just what that was like. But I had also, in the stuff I was going to bring down, the tail unit of a German incendiary bomb, which actually burns a hole through the roof of our house. It didn't set fire to the house. It fell on the eave part outside the wall and burnt through and fell to the ground. So I have this little bit, it's a metal gadget about that long that's got fins on it. It was what caused the bomb to go head first down and explode and catch fire. Anyway, I've had this thing since then, as 70 years ago. And it's been sitting in my garage, rusting away and collecting cobwebs and all the rest. So I thought, well, I'll show that to you. So, in my bag, I go out to the airport. Yes. So, first of all, they sniffed my hands and, do all the gadgets. I was having a whale of a time, everybody being quite friendly. And all of a sudden I go over and there's a young chap saying, there is something in your bags that we want to look at. I said, help yourself. So he undid the things, reached in, what is this? And I said, well, that's the tail end of a German incendiary bomb. Bomb! Oh! immediately, immediately there were at least 6 of them crowded around. Oh, you can't take that. And I said, for goodness sake, it's, you know, the part that burns has disappeared. There's nothing here but a simple little... I should have told them that it was an empty toothpaste holder or something. And I'm sure they'd have let me get away with it.
It's waiting at the Regina airport for you to...
Oh, yes. Oh, they were very nice. Yes. I had to sign pieces of paper. I've got it in my pocket now. This is my receipt for a piece of
For the bomb.
bomb.
You can add that to your collection now.
I want to ask you one more question, and I'll shut up. Somebody else is going to ask the questions. I've really been a student of the war, and the more I read and the more I forget Hollywood, but documentaries,
Yeah.
I'm amazed at how advanced the Germans were.
Oh,
They
yes.
had better tanks, they had better planes, they had better guns, they had rocketry, they had jet fighters,
Yeah.
and they lost,
Yeah.
thank God. And I wanted to know from you, at what point do you think was the turning point? To me, the heroes are the people that decoded the Enigma. Do
Yes.
you think Britain would have been lost had they not decoded that?
They might very well have been. Certainly the Battle of the Atlantic would have been anything but as successful as it was. We could not have defeated the submarine system that they had employed. And we could not have got the war materials that we needed. Mind you, there are those that will argue and say that it was the eventual might of the American forces which really triggered the end. Others would say it was when the Russians opened the second front. But I think you're right that that was probably more important than either of these other things. We could not, England could not have invaded France without the Americans. You know, we didn't have the manpower or the materials to do that. We nearly lost the Battle of Britain because we did not have the wherewithal to replace the losses, the fighters that were being lost, or the crews. So, I don't know. You may be more of a student of that than I am, but my impression is that all of these 3 things I've mentioned, or 2 that I've mentioned and the Enigma, I think they were all equally important in one way or another.
I know you would be willing to go on and on and on answering questions, and I know you will happily do so
sure.
one-on-one. But we have food waiting behind these partitions, and your voice is giving out.
Yes, I know. I apologize
So I
for
will
that.
draw the official part of this to a close. I would like to bestow upon you a Calumet College bag full of Calumet College good stuff.
Oh, that's very nice of you. Thank you.
And to thank you very much for the second in what we hope will be a continuing series of nepotism talks here at Calumet College. Thank you.
I can talk about